Chapter 10. The Hounds of the Bayous. I was sitting at the Café du Monde in the French Quarter of New Orleans with a few friends and colleagues. We were attending a psychological conference in that fascinating city, but this was a slow day, and the talks that required our attendance were not until the afternoon. So we had gathered this morning to drink coffee laced with chicory and eat beignets. For those of you who have not had the experience of having beignets, you should know that these are relatively shapeless blobs of yeast dough, which are deep fried, sprinkled with powdered sugar, and served hot. They are a cardiologist's nightmare, but a wonderful accompaniment to the dark, slightly bitter coffee. However, just like most other things that are full of fat and sweet carbohydrates, beignets seem to be addictive, and I had eaten more than I probably should have. However, one of my friends, a professor at Tulane University, had ordered another plate of this warm pastry, and when it arrived, he grabbed one for himself and pushed the plate toward me. He smiled, said, "You don't get down here to the Big Easy very often, so enjoy these while you can." I waved my hand and passed the plate to the friend sitting at my left and said, "Yeah, I do love these things, but I'm reminded of a greedy dog who was even fatter than I'm bound to get if I keep eating more of these things." This dog was known around the neighborhood for bullying or threatening any other dog that came near his bowl or any place where there was available food. On this particular day, it happened that a bakery truck, delivering cakes to a restaurant, went around a corner too fast and lost a good bit of its load. All of that cake was lying in the middle of the street, and that greedy dog made a beeline to it. And then he started to eat. And he ate, and he ate, and he ate, and he ate some more. A couple of young puppies came up while the dog was gorging himself on all that sweet stuff. These pups had been forced to live on the street and were hungry a good deal of the time, so they looked on in envy while all this wonderful food was being consumed. Still, that was one hefty dog doing the eating, and they certainly weren't going to rush up and try to grab some of his prize. Finally, when their hunger got the better of their fear, they approached to try to get a few crumbs of the cake and cookies which were just lying on the ground. But the large dog saw them and gave a low growl. He was just as greedy as he was fat. Those puppies held their peace and waited a bit longer, and then finally the braver of the two pups approached the big dog and asked, "Got enough now, sir?" "No," came the grumbled answer, "but I got down to where it don't taste so good any more. And that's where I am now, my friends." My colleague from Tulane University, which is located inside the city limits of New Orleans, laughed and said, "You obviously aren't a Louisiana hound. Our dogs down here can be hard workers, but whether they are working or not, they're always on the alert for or trying to scrounge any bit of food. Once they spot something that they can eat, they jump at it. It doesn't matter whether they're hungry or fat or have a full belly. When they find some food, they don't stop eating until they've nearly licked the ceramic glaze off of their bowl." "I don't know if that fits my observations," I protested. "A few years back, me and my friend Peter and both of our wives took a trip through the bayous. We saw a lot of hounds, but for the most part they were just lying around on the front porch or down at the foot of the stairs in the sunshine, dozing the day away. They didn't seem like they were in a frenzy to get food or were spending much time or energy working for something to eat. In fact, as I remember from that trip, I don't remember most of those hounds doing anything other than relaxing. They didn't move even when people came up and found them blocking the way. They just laid there, soaking up the sun and acting as if it was not required that they do anything for anyone. I was quite surprised to notice that the folks that owned them didn't seem to mind having dogs lying around. They just politely stepped over those lazy hounds if they happened to be in their way. I don't think that those dogs even raised an eyelid. They just acted as though it was their God given right to sleep out there in the sunshine, and they intended to exercise that right as long as they could. My colleague laughed and said, "Well, it's not their God given right to lay on a porch in the sunshine and not be bothered, but it is a right which was given to them by the state of Louisiana. In the interests of furthering your education, let me explain to you how this all came about. It all began one summer, quite a while back. It was down in the bayous where things suddenly got really strange. I think that the astronomers concluded that the situation had something to do with the solar cycle, maybe sunspots, or an increase of cosmic rays. All of these astronomical events began to interact with global warming or whatever. The result was that that year was particularly hot and damp, and probably because of the cosmic conditions, the mosquitoes in the wetlands started growing. There were reports that some mosquitoes were growing more than an inch every minute until they reached full size, which was really big. Now, mosquitoes need lots of protein to survive, and what these giant insects couldn't get from blood sucking, they started to get from meat eating. Next thing anybody knew was that these big monster mosquitoes began to kill our farmers' chickens and pigs at an alarming rate. As you might expect, folks around here began to get worried. Well, everyone knew that they needed help, so they decided to call for assistance from a really smart professor that they had heard of. He was from Tulane University, of course. This scientist knew everything there was to know about insects. The folks living out in the country and the bayous put together a delegation, and they came to the university and asked the professor, "How do we take care of the problem that we're having with these giant mosquitoes? They're killing off all of our livestock. We're afraid that when these behemoths get finished with the pigs, they'll probably go after the cows and maybe the horses and then maybe even people." Well, this erudite professor was not fazed in the least. He told the folks not to worry. He explained to them that he knew about a special strain of enormous bees which grew in Australia, which might be the solution to their problem. These giant bees didn't suck on pollen like normal bees do, but rather they ate other insects. So the professor figured that if they brought in a truckload of these bees, they would wipe out the giant mosquitoes. Unfortunately, it turned out that this entomologist didn't know everything about the way that such strange and unique insect species worked. Because of that, his plan didn't quite work the way he had expected. Instead of killing off the mosquitoes, the giant bees and the giant mosquitoes interbred. The result was a nightmare. These hybrids were also gigantic, and they inherited the big front stinger from their mosquito parent and the big rear stinger from their bee parent. With stingers on both ends, they were even more efficient hunters, and the number of livestock being lost to insects started to skyrocket. As you might expect, the folks who lived in the bayous were now really going into a panic. So the governor of the state of Louisiana offered a reward to anyone who could solve the problem of these bee mosquitoes. Well, there was this very old, very wise blue-tick hound who heard about this. At that time in history, the hounds that lived in Louisiana were not really all that well respected. They had to work hard for a living, hunting, guarding, and running around all the time trying to spot any trouble that might require their master's attention. Any time a dog took the opportunity to take a little snooze in the sun, maybe on the porch or on the stairs, they never really got to enjoy their rest. When people saw them lying there, they would kick them out of the way and send them off to find some work to do. It was a hard life. However, this blue-tick hound thought that this insect threat might just provide an opportunity that might benefit all of the dogs in the state of Louisiana. So, This sagacious old hound went to the university, Tulane University, of course, to find a professor who could translate animal language. He then convinced him to come with him to the Capitol building in Baton Rouge. The dog and the professor marched right up to the governor's office, and the dog communication expert informed the governor that they were there for a little chat about the insect problem in the bayous. The upshot of their conversation was that the governor agreed that if the hound and his other canine colleagues could get rid of these giant bee mosquitoes, then all of the dogs in the state of Louisiana would be rewarded with the right to sleep on their owner's porch in the sunshine. This included the right not to be yelled at or kicked out of the way, and these rights would be granted in perpetuity. They shook hands, or paws, and sealed the bargain. So this clever old hound went back home to the bayous and set to howling until he had gathered all of the dogs in the region. First he told them about the bargain he had struck with the governor, and next he outlined his plan to the other dogs. He then sent groups of dogs out to search the countryside, and within a day they were able to find where the bee mosquitoes were nesting. The next morning, just as the sun was rising high in the sky, and only a short time after the giant bee mosquitoes had left their hive to go out on their daily hunt for food, the dogs gathered up their courage and sneaked inside the massive insect hive. Now you've got to understand that these were country hounds, living out there in the bayous, and up to now they had not had a lot of personal care and grooming from their owners. One consequence of this, as might be expected, was that these dogs were infested with a goodly number of fleas. Once inside the hive, the pack of hounds began to follow the plan that the wise old dog had outlined for them. They rubbed their fur against the walls of the giant insect's home, and hundreds of thousands of fleas got rubbed off in the process. Next, as quick as a flash, and before any fleas could jump back onto the dogs, they dashed out, leaving the hive full of fleas. Now, of course, these fleas needed some place to live, and they needed some blood from something in order to survive. So when the bee mosquitoes returned home, the fleas found that the only living things around were these monster bugs. Naturally, given the absence of any better choice, the fleas jumped on the enormous mutant insects and started to bite. You know what happens when dogs or people have fleas biting them. Well, exactly the same thing happened to those mammoth insects. They started to itch. With all those fleas and all those flea bites, the itching got really bad. So just like dogs and people with an itch, they started to scratch. If the itch was around their rear, they would work their head around to scratch it with their big front stinger. And if it was up near their head, they would try to scratch it with their big rear stinger. The problem was that these bee mosquitoes had really been born just to sting other creatures to death and to eat them. And they weren't very good at scratching themselves with their own stingers. So when they scratched, they usually drew blood and accidentally injected some of their own venom into themselves. As a result, they all started to die, poisoned by their own weapons, and ultimately the whole hive was wiped out. The hounds got a big laugh out of all of this. Not only did they manage to wipe out the insect's threat to the bayous, but in the process they got rid of most of their own fleas. In fact, even without grooming from their owners, they would not be bothered by fleas for years to come, since the fleas now had this big pile of dead bee mosquito carcasses, which they could happily suck away on. That, my friend, is also the reason why when you travel through Louisiana you'll see so many hounds resting on the sunlight end of the porch and not being bothered by the people who own them. The governor kept his promise, and all the hounds in the bayous have benefited from that promised reward ever since. It is their state-given right that they are exercising when they snooze there. We all laughed, and I took another sip of my coffee and absent-mindedly reached for another beignet.